Good morning. Hello. We have a nice crowd. Russell and Dorothy, I knew you were here. I hadn't run across you yet. So good to see you guys. How awesome is that? So turn to 1 Timothy chapter 2, if we will. We're going to be finishing up this discussion this morning. I'm going to change my plans just a hair from what I told you last week. I want to be sure that we cover this appropriately. At the end of our last class, for everyone who maybe hasn't been here for the others, we have this series, Speech Season with Salt, and we're fielding these different questions that get brought to us. And the one that we've been discussing is, what about when when people say to us, why doesn't your church have women in front of the congregation, or women as church leaders, and so on? Do you look down upon women? Well, we've gone through all of this and demonstrated how God looks at women as complete co-equals with men, and we see it in exactly the same way also. That being stated, God has laid out differing roles for men and women, and we're showing how this is nothing new, and it's always been that way. And where we left off last week, I was trying just to breeze through the most important passage probably of all, 1 Timothy 2, to try to get through it. It didn't happen, but I'm kind of grateful that it didn't, because I would actually like to slow down on that to A, cover it thoroughly, B, to be able to field any and every comment that we might have about it, and C, also to potentially ask every question that might remain or that might come up from it, so that we can be prepared, and really, first of all, just to make sure we understand the teaching ourselves. And secondly, hopefully then, to be able to effectively communicate it as to why God has laid it out the way that He has. So, we're going to get into that. Before we do, though, I do want to mention about the handsome gentleman in the center and back. Go ahead and turn around and enjoy that sight. Oh, yeah. That is Mr. Parker Burrow, as you might know. And Parker is holding a microphone for a good reason. We're going to begin this process, thank you, Parker, starting today. Okay? We might even switch it up, let Caden have some enjoyment of this also and get some attention. But whenever you do have a comment and you raise your hand, he's going to bring that mic over to you so you can talk into it. Everybody can hear. It's also going to be a benefit for our recordings, because at times, if you've watched any of them, there will be like 30-second lulls in that. So everyone will be able to hear that, and hopefully we'll be able to get more out of our Bible class. And thank you for helping me out. Bless you. Okay, so we're going to get started in 1 Timothy chapter 2, okay? And I want to go back and review just a little bit these first 3 verses we did get to discuss, I should say 4. And then we're going to get into the reasoning, which is also our memory verse from last week, 1 Timothy 2:12. But to start with verse 8, okay, the apostle says, I desire. And that can be translated okay right there. It's possible from the Greek boulomai. And that means to desire, I want, or I will. It's just that it seems that there's more to it than this. Another connotation of this term is I have a purpose. And I really think that's what he's saying here. It's not, oh, this is my personal whim. First of all, we've already established from 1 Corinthians 14, verse 37, he says that if you want to be a spiritual person, or you recognize yourself to be a prophet or a spokesman for God, then recognize the things that I write to you, they are not my personal whims, they are the commandments of the Lord. Even if this is accurately translated as desire, the idea here is I have a divine desire, or I'm passing on the divine will, and my will is nothing more than God's own, as Jesus spoke concerning His Father. So I think what he might be saying here by definition of the term is I have a purpose behind what it is that I'm teaching you about these differing roles in the church. Okay, so continuing, I desire therefore that the men near, that's the male gender, pray everywhere. That's an important term. Where's that going to leave out? Well, okay, no, I'm sorry. Yeah, where is that going to be? Yeah. Nowhere. Okay, everywhere is covering all. Okay? I desire that the male gender pray, understood, lead in prayer everywhere. Now, I'll be the first to admit there is a context to this. And sometimes you'll hear, well, the context here is corporate church worship. It's when the whole congregation is gathered together. And I've never been able to find anything in this text that suggests that to be the case. Now, there is a context we know that this is obviously a mixed gathering, right? And it appears that they're going to be Christians that are involved, obviously. But it is a mixed gathering, and it could be the whole church gathered together. It might be a part of the church gathered together. I'm going to show you here in a minute why it might be just a tiny sliver of the church together. Everywhere there is a purpose as God lays out these roles in relationships, and in particular with the genders. So there's a purpose behind, and this is a divine desire of God that the male gender lead in prayer everywhere, lifting up holy hands. Okay, does anybody recall from last week? I know we went through this really quickly, but why is it here? It doesn't seem like he's talking about literally hands are going into the air. Not that there's anything wrong with that in worship, including in prayer. And we do have sometimes in the Bible where actually we know that did occur. But why does it sound like he's probably not talking about literally hands going in the air right here? Okay. Good. So it's an emblem of something that's going on within. Very good. That makes a lot of sense. Remember, this is a command, right, that he's giving. Okay, a divine command that's being passed along. And if the only way for this command to be performed is to do literally everything that's spoken here, what he's saying is the only way that your prayers are ever going to be heard, guys, is if your hands are in the air whenever you're talking to God. Now, even for people I know, and again, I'm not being at all critical about this, I think it can be a beautiful gesture with hands being placed into the air, whether in worship or in prayer. But my point being this, with those who do like to do that a lot, who are friends of mine or acquaintances, I have never known anyone to say that, hey, the only way God's going to hear your prayers is if your hands are up in the air. But that's what it would have to be, because this is a command. And this is something everywhere that's always to be done. We didn't read this one last week because of a squish on time. But James chapter 4, verse 8, we know this one pretty well. James 4:8, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. And then we're told, cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. So he says, hey, to get close to God, here's something you have to do. You're going to have to clean your hands. Okay, so let's all just take a time out here and make sure everything's on the right plane with God, and let's just all go to the restroom and a couple at a time, like at school, and we'll all go wash our hands then, and we'll be in good shape. Well, we understand that's not what he's saying. What does he mean by cleanse your hands? Clean your hands, wash them. There you go. Talking about being a holy and sanctified people, Justin. And so the hands that are used for everyday activity, what he's saying is you need to clean up your actions. Now, if we had more time, we would read, and this is a good parallel to this, Isaiah chapter 1. Isaiah 1, verses 12 through 17, it's mentioned God to his people that, we have this disconnect because your hands are full of blood. You need to clean your hands. I don't think they're walking around with bloody hands, probably, do you? But he's saying you need to clean up your actions. And he talks about you need to treat the poor the right way. You need to take care of the widows and orphans. You need to give me the sacrifices that I deserve. There are all these things you're doing with your hands, spiritually speaking, and you're doing them the wrong way. And you have as well in Isaiah 59, verses 1 through 3, about the Lord's hand is not shortened that it cannot save, nor his ear heavy that it cannot hear. Your iniquities have separated you from your God. And then he mentions, clean up your hands. Find forgiveness for your wrongdoing and start doing things the right way, the way God has prescribed them. So the point being this, hands are a common figure in Scripture for the things that are done with the hands. Joe, hold on just one sec, if you will. And for the shorter comments, well, I'll probably just try to repeat those. And for ones that...
I don't know how to need this. Even just taking the literal context of the verse that we're looking at, rather than, and I appreciate what you've done, but let's just take a logical look at raising your hands in the air to pray, and whether or not that's the only way that it would be acceptable. Let's look at not only our lives, other people's lives, even scriptural examples of prayer. Let's take a look at Paul in prison, praying to God, okay? We don't know the situation there, but he was likely shackled, chained, maybe shackled. We do know in certain cases shackled or chained to another person. Okay, his ability to raise his hands in the air while praying could have easily been non-existent.
Especially in stocks. Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Right.
Our lives, depending on where it is we're praying, what it is we're doing. I have a lot of time on the road, back and forth to work every day. A certain amount of that is in prayer and so on to God. I'm not going to take my hands off the wheel while I'm doing that. And in other cases, those are sick, those who are ill, maybe those who are injured, maybe those who were born with such a disability that either they're paralyzed or so on. We know God and we understand his love for us, and he is not going to limit our ability to talk to him with this physical action. It's just simply not in his nature to do that.
Yeah, good. Thanks for sharing that, Joe. Let's go to Rick Parker.
Well, one of the questions I ask is, raising your hands, couldn't that somewhat show submissiveness before the Lord? You know,
I think so.
That would give you, like, you know, I bow down before you even start your prayer, you know, or during your prayer, that you're being very submissive.
Yeah, I think it could, Rick. So the idea there maybe being in a submissive position, especially on one's knees. Who was that? Was that Caden? No, I don't think so. Maybe been Tripp. I would ask about posture and prayer, and we had a Q&A on one point of this, and I was really interested by that, to dig through Scripture, and I was never able to find an instance of people offering a prayer to God where they were seated. What I've always found with that is they're either standing, they're on their knees, or they're on their faces, with one exception that I could find, and it's in a case of a man who's sick with Hezekiah. And even there, it doesn't seem like he's seated, but maybe more lying on his bed. He's so sick he can't even move, right? Now, I'm not saying I think it's wrong necessarily to pray to God as we're seated, but I just find that interesting. We don't find any examples of that. And yeah, our very posture and our mannerisms can be submissive and be a way of showing respect to God. Good. Okay, yes, John. Oh, sorry. I was thinking, come on, man. No.
Well, one thing I was going to mention is if we finish reading verse 8, it explains exactly what that means.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Maybe you're going there.
I am, yeah. But thank you, John. Yeah, super. Okay, so let's do just that. Thank you for the lead in. I have a purpose behind this teaching that the male gender pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands. So it's not just, hey, if it's a man, that's good enough. It's men who have a connection to God and are living the Christian life. And I think we probably understand these aren't sinlessly perfect individuals, but are consistently trying to live for the Lord and rely on him, by the way, for forgiveness when they have it. Okay, so as John pointed out, the rest of it I do think helps to explain without wrath. Well, who's going to pray out of anger or while they're angry? Well, if you consider the context, going back up into verses 1 and 2, it's mentioned, hey, pray for our governmental authorities, and we'll get back into this in a moment, that we may lead a quiet and a peaceable life. Well, the Christian life back at this time is anything but quiet and peaceable. And a big part of that is government being involved. What do you think might have been a temptation for some Christians? How might they have been inclined to use prayer during this time that the government's mistreating them and persecuting them and killing their loved ones, threatening their lives also? What might be a temptation right here? If you're angry, what would you be angry about? There you go. They could be using prayer, trying to, as a tool for vengeance. And God says, I don't want that. By the way, they might be upset with God. We have James chapter 1, count it all joy when you go through these different trials that you face. But be careful never to blame it on whom? On God. Because God does not bring trial, the nasty things into our lives. He does that's a different conversation. But it's the devil who brings the bad things into our lives. It's the devil who invites us to do wrong. Now, God lets him do that because through this process, he can help us to grow. We can improve through it. But be careful. And then he goes on to say this, let every man be slow to speak, slow to wrath, and quick to hear, for the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. When things go wrongly, it's easy to place blame in the wrong places. I've experienced this in my own life and going through a period of trial, and I found myself, thankfully, I feel like not blaming God, but I wanted to channel that blame and that anger somewhere else. And I'm ashamed to say that through that, my wife received some of that, my kids received some that they did not deserve, and I didn't even realize what I was doing because of the human tendency. We're angry and we want to express that some way. Don't channel it in the wrong way. Don't channel it in the wrong way toward God either. It's not his fault. And so that may be what's meant right here without wrath, and also without doubting. You know, things are going terribly, and it's not, I don't mean this flippantly, but, you know, throwing up a Hail Mary, well, maybe this will work if I talk to God about this. It's going to him saying, I know this is going to help things. I can't tell you exactly all the ways how, but I know God, and I know it's going to help. Okay, make sure through the hardship that you trust God. Who do we need leading us when there are mixed gatherings? Whether that's a whole church, a fraction of the church, or I'm going to show you here in a minute, even a tiny sliver of the church. God says, I want the male gender leading in prayer everywhere, not just because someone's a man, but because someone's living the Christian life and not angry at me and not angry at others and not using prayer as a vindictive tool, and also without doubting, actually has trust in me that what's being spoken is going to be answered. Verse 9, in like manner also. Now, verses 9 and 10 almost sound like they don't belong if you look at verse 8 and then from about verse 11 all the way to the end. And they do, and I'm going to tell you why here in just a minute. What he's saying is this: I have a purpose in the role, the divine role that's being laid out for the male gender. In the same way, or there is a role for ladies also when spiritual devotion is being exercised in mixed company. And here's a part of it, verse 9. That the women adorn themselves in modest apparel. That means seemly or well arranged. It's not simply having on enough. There's actually more to it than that. I've heard it expressed before. Well, I could wrap myself in a bed sheet and come in and I'm modest. I would disagree completely with that statement because it doesn't mean having enough covered. What it means is seemly or well arranged, like it goes, you know, in an environment. If someone walks in wrapped in a bed sheet, they're going to stick out like a sore thumb, and that's the complete opposite of the teaching right here. So seemly, well arranged with propriety, and this has a couple of flavors to it. One is to have a sense of bashfulness or a sense of shame. And the other one is this, to dress with regard to others. So it's not just what I think about what I have on, but it's also what others might perceive about me. Now the second one, moderation, I want to skip over this for just a minute. We're going to come back to it. Not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing. I'm going to tell you why I'm convinced he's not saying that ladies, unless you're coming to church with bedhead, you're not pleasing God. I don't think he's saying that at all. I don't believe he's saying if you have on a wedding ring that you're a sinner. Nor do I believe that he's telling us that it's wrong to wear clothing that has some value to it. Keep your spot right here and turn to 1 Peter 3. There's a very good explanation and inspiration for this. It's the same teaching, but the wording is just a little bit different. I think it helps bring it to light better. So 1 Peter 3, verse 3, do not let your adornment be merely or only outward, arranging the hair, wearing gold, putting on fine apparel. You have all the same elements right here that are mentioned as you have in the 1 Timothy 2 passage. The difference being this: in the New King James Version, which I've quoted to you, there are two words in italics, meaning they actually don't belong. They've been put in by the translators to try to provide clarity. And by the way, I think they've done, for the most part, a good job in that. So literally, merely or only is not found. Neither is fine. So a little more strictly, and the ESV does a great job in the literal wording of this translation. When it says, do not let your adornment be outward, arranging the hair, wearing gold, or putting on apparel or clothes. So strictly taken, what this reads is, ladies, do not dress yourselves on the outside, do not put on clothes. That's what that says. Well, obviously, it's not intended to be literal. This is a figurative statement. And this is, in grammar is what's called, Roy, an elliptical statement. And in grammar, in an ellipsis, there are three words that are implied, not found, but to be understood. One of these is only or merely, as the New King James has it, and then ... down the road you have but also. And so it's obvious what he's saying is, do not let your adornment merely or only be this, as an elliptical statement, ... but also, as we're going to go on into verse 4. And so what he's saying here isn't that it's wrong to fix your hair or to have jewelry or to put on clothes, but it's to be more than that whenever you present yourself to the world and to your brothers and sisters in Christ. Okay, does that make sense? Now, I do want to read verse 4, because then we won't have to turn back to it while we're here, 1 Peter 3. As you're going to Roy, I'm going to go ahead and read verse 4. So do not let your adornment be merely outward, arranging the hair, wearing gold, putting on apparel, but rather let it be the hidden person of the heart with the incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet, hold on to that word, spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God. And we'll come back to that, but feel free to go back to the thought of verse 3 if you'd like, Roy.
Okay, with regard to women, how they are to adorn themselves, I've heard people say that this is specific to the assembly, and that this may even be specific to just Ephesus. But I don't see anywhere in the scriptures that makes this specific to either Ephesus or the assembly, even though Timothy is in Ephesus, and even though women may not have been adorning themselves as they should have been. I think it's a thing that applies to Christians in all circumstances.
Which, very good, Roy, which would go back to everywhere.
Yeah.
And which he's qualified for the men, but when he goes on to say, well, in the same way for the ladies, in other words, I'm talking about every setting where there's mixed company, right? Thank you, Roy, for that. And I agree with the reiteration of that. I haven't found anything that would limit this to the church's worship assembly, corporate, where everybody's gathered together, although it's certainly applicable and it fits, but it's just applicable to more circumstances to that being everywhere. Go ahead, Jimmy. Right. Which ties in. So thank you, Jimmy, for bringing us back to that. That's excellent to bridge this. And I want to run with that, okay? And I didn't cut you off, did I? Okay, good. Okay, I just want to make sure. Thank you. Very, very good, Jimmy. Okay, but in contrast to this, I want to move on from this, but to make sure we understand. But in contrast to this, which is proper for women professing godliness with good works. Now, we know what godliness is by definition, the base of the word, God, and leanness or likeness, it's godlikeness, or to be like God. But what's a good synonym for godliness? There are a few possibilities here. Anything stand out to you? Godliness. We would commonly refer to this as what? Righteousness, I like it. Holiness, super. Humility, okay, good. And these are all good terms. Here's one that comes to my mind, spirituality. That makes sense. Godliness, God is spirit, and so being like God, we're being spiritual. Even though we live in a physical world, we're living like Him. And I think that's the thought here. Verses 9 and 10, the emphasis isn't on physicality or the body, but it's on spirituality or the soul, the things that really matter, and that our life itself demonstrates that. Okay, now, let me point something out here. I believe what he's establishing, if you're wondering, well, how does this fit in and dress and things we put on our body, and how does that fit into this discussion and the teaching of roles of the male gender and the female gender? I believe it's this, verse 8. Not that we're putting men in front of us to glorify them and put a spotlight, not that, but my point is this, though. A little bit later, bless you, when Brad leads the service, everyone's going to understand, well, Brad's up and he's in charge of and he's leading the worship service, and everyone's going to recognize and know that about Brad. But the thought is this, as males are being leaders, the role for God in the female gender, when spiritual exercise and mixed company is going on, is not to stand out in that same way, but to blend in. And it's a submissiveness of a lifestyle. And that's what we read in 1 Peter 3, of a gentle and quiet spirit. That's who I am from the inside. And because I am that way, it's going to display itself in all these different ways. It's not like a light switch, and I'm going to be the opposite of this throughout life. But then whenever I enter into a mixed assembly of God's people where spiritual exercise is going on, I got to flip that switch off and be someone different now. It's not that at all. But that's the kind of spirit or disposition I carry around within me. And because of that, it's reflected in my dress. And because of that, it's going to be reflected in another way. Verse 11. Let a woman, or the female gender, learn in silence with all submission. Okay, and I pointed out last week, this word silence, hesukia, this is not the same word that's found in 1 Corinthians 14. That's sagao. Sagao means absolute silence, don't say a thing. And what's the context of the mixed gathering of 1 Corinthians 14 where that teaching is given? Let your women keep silent, sagao, and the church does not say anything. Well, it's obviously not talking about the song service because that's a command that's given to her where she's supposed to be speaking out in the mixed gathering with religious exercise. But what's the context of that teaching in 1 Corinthians 14? What's that sliver right there? That's a section, and what's going on? The preaching portion. During the preaching portion, nothing is to be said. This is not teaching on the same thing. It's a different word because it's a different setting. Let a woman learn in silence. That's poorly translated in the New King James Version. I hope you have something different in your version. Something like quietness or submission. And that's different than complete silence. And by the way, I want to take just a little bit of time to show you this is not unique in Bible teaching to the female gender. The same teaching, the same word is given for males. Turn to 2 Thessalonians 3. Keeping your spot, obviously, in 1 Timothy 2. But 2 Thessalonians 3, verses 10 through 12. Same guy, by the way, writing this letter is the penman of the former. And he says in verse 10, for even when we were with you, we commanded you this, if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat. For we hear that there are some among you who are not working at all, but are busybodies. Now those who are such, we command and exhort through our Lord Jesus Christ that they work in quietness and eat their own bread. Same base word, hesukia, that's used about the male gender, and of course would apply here to females also, but that's given for God's people. We're all to do our jobs in life in quietness, or hesukia. Now, if that means you can't say anything, that tells us it would be sinful to speak, to utter a sound on the job site. 40 hours plus a week. Obviously, why should we as Christians, men included, show submissiveness at the job site? Most of us are employees, and we're not in charge. And we should be submissive and humble, Freddie, enough to recognize that. And even when I'm told to do something I really don't want to do, I do it with a smile. And when the boss is gone, I don't talk poorly of him or her behind his or her back about those kinds of things because I am a submissive person. It's not a switch that I turn on and off at the job site. It's something that's on all the time. Being a Christian is all about submission. Now, earlier in chapter 2 of 1 Timothy, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life. Toward whom? What's the context? I desire, therefore, 1 Timothy 2, 1 and 2, that prayers, supplications, intercessions, giving of thanks be made for all men, including those who are in positions where? Higher up in government authority, okay? So for our kings and our officials, that we may lead a quiet or submissive and peaceable way of life. Being a Christian is all about submission, male or female. And it begins right there when we make the choice to die to ourselves and we surrender control to Jesus. We often use this term for him, Lord, which sounds great, super, but do we live it out? That means I am a servant and I submit myself to you. And because it's who you made me to be in your own image, and because it's who I am now, it's not a switch I turn on and off. It's one that stays on. I live that way permanently. And that's why I have the relationship, 1 Timothy 2, that I do to my government. That's why I have the relationship that I do, 2 Thessalonians 3, to my employer. I submit myself not because it's new in those circumstances, but because that's who I am. We had more time, which we won't. 1 Peter 3, where we were earlier, verses 1 through 6, as wives, you submit yourselves to your husbands, not because it's a switch that you flip on in your marriage, because that's the lifestyle that you live. By the way, verse 7 that we sometimes overlook, guys, likewise, or in the same way as your wives to you, there's a sense and there are ways in which as husbands, we submit ourselves to our wives. Not that they lead our relationship or lead our families, but that we understand God made us and wired us differently. And just because we might be physically stronger doesn't mean we use that and abuse that to get our way all the time. We dwell with them with understanding, and we give honor to the wife. Understanding how God made us, and maybe we don't fully understand it, but we work to try to understand it. And ladies, the same way toward us, and guys, and how we tick. It's a give-take relationship in both ways to a degree. It's about submission. We submit ourselves in our marriages and in our families, not because it's a switch that we turn on whenever we go home, but because it stays on, and that's who God made us to be. So I just want to point that out. This teaching about ladies being quiet or submissive in spirit is not unique to them. Males are taught the same thing. Job site, that's your role, males, just as it is for females when you're an employee. In government, whether you're female or male, God expects us to be submissive and quiet in spirit, not stirring up trouble all the time, because that's who He made us to be. In different environments, He has differing roles for us. And when we're talking about this environment, in a mixed setting, when there are males and females, whether big or whether small, God has reasons for these roles that He's laying out. Go ahead, Parker, to Joe, I believe. Thanks. Was here and what's existed in the history of the world. Some of that can be good, some of that cannot be good as well. So I do think that's a big part of it. But I agree. I think humble, which is really the same thing, it just sounds so much better and easier to accept, I think, for us. Brad? Right. It's what He wants. I mean, it's as simple as that. It's what He wants. Who He is, what He's given us. I mean, what right does any of us to say, no, I'm not. Recognize who He is and who we are. It's humility, Joe. Freddie, that's all it is just to properly understand. And it's not to have low self-esteem. It's just not to over-esteem. It's just to esteem properly oneself. So, yeah, thank you for that, both you guys. Okay, so let's get into this bulk right here. And I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. That's the female gender over the male gender. And we don't have time to get into this. I knew we wouldn't. But if you have any interest in this, let me know afterward. We can talk more, and I can get you some really good material on this. We've had studies in this in the past. I can prove biblically that this is not a reference to a male boy, okay? Christian or not. I can prove that biblically. To a male boy, well, of course, a male child is what I meant by that. To a boy, okay, to make it easier, is not a reference to a boy or to a male child. It's a reference to a male adult. I can prove that biblically, okay? Again, we don't really have time right now to get into that. But I do want to ask this. A woman, how many? A man, how many? One. Okay. Notice he doesn't say, I do not permit women, plural, to teach over men, plural. Or a woman, singular, to teach over men, plural. I do not permit a woman, singular, one, to teach over a man, one. Not even in a one-on-one setting, okay? Now, does this apply to corporate church worship? Absolutely, no question about it. But it also slims down to even a one-on-one setting. It's not God's will for one of the female gender to lead a man in spiritual exercise. Now, we're not talking about preaching here, but we're talking about what kind of setting? Okay, which is just exactly like what we have going on right now. Quiet. It doesn't mean a word can't be spoken. It doesn't mean a scripture can't be read, a question can't be asked, or a comment can't be offered. But that's the reason that we have the Christian male gender leading in these kinds of settings, because it's a mixed gathering for spiritual exercise, whether it's 1-on-1, 2-on-2, 1-on-12, or 4-on-500. It's the same principle involved no matter what. Okay, Roy?
Question about that. What about Acts 18 with regard to Aquila and Priscilla, a woman teaching Apollos?
Very good. So that's a great question. So the question is this: what about in Acts chapter 18 when you have a female with a male, Aquila and Priscilla, and it mentions they, plural, take Apollos aside and explain to him the way of God more perfectly? Okay. Now, let me just identify what's not stated in Acts 18. That they took him aside and Priscilla led a Bible study. Right? That's not mentioned. What is mentioned is they took him aside, and they both had some role in helping teach and explaining to this man what he needed to do to better A, understand things himself, and B, to teach people the true way of God in its fullness. Okay, now going back to 1 Timothy 2. I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority, not period, prepositional phrase, over a man, or to take a leadership position in the expression of God's will over a man. Okay, you go back to Acts chapter 18, there is nothing in that passage that stands out that that Priscilla taught over Apollos, but that she did teach Apollos. And by the way, it's the same thing in our song service, Colossians 3:16. We're to be teaching and admonishing one another. And the songs that we sing, that's a command to women just as much as it is to men. They are teaching, the female gender is teaching us, those of us who are of the male gender, in that process. Why is that okay? That doesn't contradict anything we're taught in Scripture. Females can. In fact, there are instances where they must teach males. But what's not happening in the song service here a little bit later is Brad stands up and leads us in it. We do not have a female Christian up here leading over the men. And that's the difference. There's teaching that's going on, but she's not teaching over the man as she does so. She's not leading it. And so does that makes sense? There's nothing in Acts 18 that tells us that Priscilla taught over Apollos or took the lead of that Bible discussion, but that she did have some input that she shared with him, teaching him about the Lord's way. So that's a really good question. Okay, so back in our text here, over a man, and now let's get into this for the final 5 minutes we have remaining. It's perfect. Here are the two reasons that we're given. Have you been wondering about that? Everybody, and that's good. We should want to know the reasons. God always has a purpose. Remember the lead-in. I divinely desire. I have a purpose in what I'm telling. What's that purpose? Number one is birth order. For Adam was formed first, and then Eve. In terms of gender, the male gender came first. That doesn't mean the male gender is more important or more valuable. It means the male gender was given more responsibility because of birth order. I understood this very well, John, in my family. I'm the youngest of four. I was never put in charge of anything, and it's probably a good thing. Anytime Mom and Dad were to leave, as we started to get older, the siblings, it was always my sister Bonnie, who was the oldest, and or my brother Clint, who was put in charge. And that didn't always end well either. But there was less chaos, I assure you, than if I, the youngest, would have been in charge. I learned that. I understood. Okay, hey, I'm a guy in this, but I'm never going to be in charge because I was born last. And no one looks to you for leadership whenever you're born last. Well, the male gender was born first. And now I understand more because in my family, Reagan's used to being in charge. You can probably see that in the way she carries everything around. Mama's not here today, so she's mama de facto, okay, right now and today. Kobe's starting to get a little more responsibility whenever we need, him to look after and to do something. Kyler's never given any. Rowan will never, ever, ever be given any responsibility. She's the last. It's birth order. The male gender, we do the same thing. Does that mean we're unfair? Does that mean that my parents love me less? my siblings would say they love me more. And I don't know, it could be. No, and with my kids, does that mean I love Reagan and I love Kobe more? No, it's just birth order. We do that all the time. God's fair. He does the same thing. Birth order of the genders. The second thing is this. And Adam was not deceived in the fall, the sin in the garden. But the woman being deceived fell into transgression. It's one thing to do something that's wrong. It's another thing to completely turn your heart away from something or someone. In relationships, if there's infidelity that's gone on, whether that's outside or within marriage, a lot of times one of the first questions that's asked was, did it mean anything? Is there something there? That's really difficult to overcome. The one's hard enough, but the one seems like, it's not, but it seems like it's impossible because the heart gets involved. That's what's stated here. And by the way, this isn't a compliment of Adam. He did what was wrong, and it sounds like, well, I know what I'm doing is wrong, but I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. But the difference is the woman did what was wrong, but her heart was turned away. She was deceived. She actually thought, I can't trust our Father. I can't trust God any longer. And it's portrayed as a more significant sin in the sense that it's not just an action, but as well it's a turning away from the Spirit. And so gender-wise, there are consequences for this. And it's the second one that's given. Adam's heart was not turned away, but the woman, in addition to her actions, her heart was also turned away from God. And so there's some gender ramifications from that. Let's go, Parker, right here before we wrap it up. This is Rick, sorry. Yeah, Rick. You got 1 minute.
Saying basically, this all got started with Adam and Eve. Okay. Our roles were set in the Garden of Eden.
Ryan, okay, I'm going to bring that back in just a moment. Okay, let's read verse 15 as we close. Well, how significant is this, what God teaches us? Nevertheless, she, the female gender, will be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with self-control. Okay, very, very quickly. There are three views of this. One is she will be saved in childbearing. This is the Christ child who is to come. That doesn't make any sense because Jesus already came and he left 3 decades ago, and this is a future tense verb, okay? I don't think this is referring to a Jesus prophecy right here. I don't believe it's saying also that, well, as long as a woman has kids, she's all right. She's going to be going to heaven. Well, we know a lot of wonderful Christian women who haven't been able to bear children as well, in the Bible. That couldn't make sense either. I believe it's this. Childbearing is a role that is unique to women. Why was Mary chosen to bear the Christ child even though there's no human father? He can't have a woman do that, or a man do that. Only a woman can perform that role. I believe this is synecdoche, where a part stands for the whole. And what he's saying is, nevertheless, even though females have sinned against God, they can still be saved. They can still find forgiveness. God still loves them just as much. He still values them. But she has to be willing to accept the role that God has laid out for her in the church, in the family, context of 1 Timothy 2, in religious exercise. And it's not just that. It's not just because, well, you're a good lady. If they continue in faith, love, and holiness with self-control, well, there has to be spirituality that's connected to that also. And as long as a lady is willing to accept and submit, be humble about God's desires for her life, she can still be saved. Now, I want to close on this. Turn to 1 Corinthians 6. Because I want to show the equality and the fairness of God and how he says exactly the same thing about males. It's not just true of females. 1 Corinthians 6, verse 9. Do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor homosexuals, nor sodomites, nor thieves, nor covetous, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor extortioners will inherit the kingdom of God. Okay, I want to talk about one word just in brevity right here. Okay, homosexuals. That's when a male plays the male act with a female. Okay? And of course also it's when a female would play, regardless of how you want to look at it, with another female, that role. This one's different though. And some translations don't have this second word, and it's a travesty. They should. They're different concepts. The other one is, that's sodomites. I mixed it around. The word that's translated as homosexual in the New King James, I like the Old King James rendition of this, even though it's not a word we use often. Effeminate. What's the base of that word? Effeminate. feminine. And what that is in a sexual relationship, it is a male playing the role of a female, but there's a thought behind this. It's a male who's acting like a female. Why? Probably because he wants to be a female. Now, 2,000 years later, look at what we have going on in our world. At first, it was, well, I don't want to be identified as a male, I'm a female. I don't want to be identified as a female, I want to be identified as a male. And now it's become, I don't want to be identified by a gender at all. Why? We've been made the way we are. Male. We have no choice in it because someone has a desire for our lives and for us to act out a role, whether that's male or female. And we say, not we personally, but we say, well, I just want to be identified with that by they, not he or she. First of all, that makes no grammatical sense because they is plural and you are a singular regardless of whether you're male or female, so stop it. It would have to be it, okay? And for some reason, we don't hear that one, but it's the only thing that makes sense in the number, okay? But anyway, that's beside the point. My point is this. Do you not know that one who God made to carry out a male role, but who says, no, I want to carry out a female role instead, will never make it to heaven, is what's being stated. 1 Timothy 2, one who's been made as a female and for that role and says, well, I want to have this position. I don't want to be in any submissive roles. I want to be in these leadership spots. Will never make it to heaven. The person who makes it to heaven is one who's filled with humility. You remember Mary when the angel, Wednesday night adult class, shows up and says, hey, great news, you're going to have a baby. How can this be? I've never been intimate with a man. And she's told the power of the highest is going to come upon you and God's going to get involved. You remember her attitude? Great. Let it be to your maid, what'd she call herself? Your maid servant, according to your will. She has a womb. God needs a human being with a womb, and a special one, a godly one, to carry this child. And she says, I'm your servant. You let my life be whatever you want it to be for you. And that's what makes her so special. It's what makes males special in the Bible too. Oh, that's what you want? Great. I don't know exactly how it's going to work, but I trust you, and however you can use me in that way. We have to be humble enough to submit ourselves, even if it's in the roles that God has given us. And to be wise enough, Rick, to understand this is not something new today. It's something that's always been around. It goes back to the law of Moses. It goes back to the patriarchal age, all the way to the beginning of time. It goes back to Adam and Eve. God made human beings with different roles in life. But the beauty is this. He looks at all human beings as worth exactly the same. I hope that's a help going through and spending this last period on this. For next week, I know we're out of time. For next week, please be contemplating this one, the one that I gave you last week, which was my original plan. And that is, do you believe that miracles still exist today? Have you ever encountered that question? Let me tell you this. Our middle schoolers in my Bible class at the Cross Christian School, we're getting ready to go into our debates for first semester. They've chosen their topics, and one of the topics they've selected is whether miracles still happen today. I didn't feed that to them. They're debating that among themselves, looking into Scripture. If kids are doing it as adults, we need to be prepared for it also. Same memory verse, 1 Corinthians 13:10. Thanks for saying a minute or two after. Appreciate it.